And welcome everyone. Thanks for giving up your Sunday night to try to get better at this. As Brett says, it is a really important topic and just a very common condition with a lot of concern around it and its the effects on brains. So the better we are at dealing with it in our game, the better it is for everyone involved. So I'm going to talk about how to recognize it effectively during the game live. So if we can flick on to the first slide. So hopefully most people intuitively will have some idea of what it looks like when someone is concussed. And the signs that you'll see, one of the most obvious is loss of consciousness. Loss of consciousness doesn't necessarily medically lead on to concussion every time, but obviously in the game, that is a critical sign. If there's been a loss of consciousness, that player needs to leave the ground and not return until they've seen a medical professional. And a suspicion of brief loss of consciousness. So other things to look for are people lying on the ground being slow to get up, and being slow to get up is one of the most common signs of a concussion in a contact sport. You might see loss of balance or coordination, so that's ataxia, where the player is staggering or off balance or uncoordinated. You may be able to tell that they're disorientated or confused. And then any visible injury to face or head, if they've got a big laceration over their brow, obviously something's hit them. Usually in rugby, that's a blunt object like an elbow or a head, and you need to check beyond the obvious laceration to see if they've also suffered a concussion. So that one's not a sign of concussion, but it's something that would raise your suspicion. Grabbing or clutching of the head and the dazed, blank or vacant look. There was a study in the NFL, and that dazed, blank or vacant look in that study was 100% specific for concussion. I'm not sure if that's always the same. That can be difficult if you don't know the player. There's also a bunch of symptoms. That's harder when you're just watching a game. But if you hear someone talking about, and this may be the coaches or the parents, that their vision is blurry, they feel dizzy, bright light or loud noises are bothering them. They may feel unusually fatigued, obviously problems with memory or orientation of where they are or when it is, and finding it hard to think or concentrate. So people describe being in a fog or not themselves, not quite right, not 100%. And then occasionally we see slightly less common ones, but more common than you'd think, where people become more emotional and they might be very irritable or short or tearful or depressed. And those can all be symptoms of concussions that you might hear vocalized. Some of those are probably a little bit later on, but you may see them reasonably acutely as well. So if we jump on to the next slide. Yep, and we can flick through into that. There are a couple of things just worth mentioning. So there are red flags that would make you worry that it is more than a concussion and in fact something that needs immediate medical attention. So concussion doesn't normally worsen after it has occurred. So if they are getting subsequent loss of consciousness, or their level of consciousness is reducing, or their headache is worsening, or they start vomiting an hour later or 2 hours later, those are all signs that more could be going on, and you'd worry maybe that there was a bleed in the brain. So subsequent deterioration is a real red flag. And then thinking about the neck, numbness or weakness in their arms or legs, or severe neck pain are also things that would make you concerned. There's a neck injury, a serious neck injury, seizures or convulsions, things where they're actually slurring their speech, because that would be uncommon with concussion alone. Behavioral change, as I say, can be concussion, but can also be a sign of a more significant head injury. And if their confusion is increasing, or that behavior change is increasing in particular, those are things to worry about. So if that's happening after a game or a training, then you need to get that person in to be urgently assessed. We flick on to the next one. So it's probably good to, we've got examples here, and you're going to see some videos. These are from the professional game because, well, basically the video quality is higher, but this is the kinds of things that you should be looking for, especially for your referees when you're managing a game. which will give you a clue that the player is concussed. Some are more obvious than others. So if we can start with this first one. And there's a system which elite doctors use to assess possible examples of concussion. Now, we have the ability to look at video replays, but if you watch this, and you can see a player there who's obviously in trouble. And below the video, we've got the 5 stages of that impact that we kind of want in our head to assess. So first of all, and it will go back in slow motion, was there a head impact? You look at their immediate response to that impact, the first couple of seconds, and then a delayed response. So if you watch this, we're going to look, was there a head impact? So I think we'll see a different view. Yes, there was, and his immediate response. So start thinking about what you're seeing there. Right, so he's hit his hip, and he's unconscious. And what you're seeing there is a postural, tonic posturing or a fencing reflex. His brain is shut down to the point where only his brain stem is really trying to protect him by pushing both his arms out in front of him. And obviously that's an immediate sign of significant impact to the head, and he needs to leave the field, and the elite staff are clearly concerned. So if you see any of that kind of posturing, their arms straight out in front of them, then they should be immediately removed, okay, and assessed. So we're going to watch another video now. And both, obviously, loss of consciousness and any kind of posturing are one of the criteria ones you hear about for immediate removal in the elite game without any other further tests. There's no further tests. That player is deemed concussed. Now, it may not be as obvious as that first one. If you just watch the scrum and look back at where the scrum was, and you can see the player lying there. He's not moving, motionless on the ground. And again, you'd have to suspect loss of consciousness. Now he's popped up just at the end of that footage. You see, he suddenly just pops up to his feet and tries to rejoin the game. So it's critical that you kind of see that initial period where he's clearly no good, because if you miss that, if you're watching the other way, then he will try to rejoin the game. And often in a confused state, players will try to do that. You can actually see him fall out of the scrum on his knees. He's down now. Now, to be honest, this is slightly unusual for concussion. He may have had a head impact in that scrum. Medically, you'd have to think about cardiac problems or neck problems as well. But at the end of the day, he should leave the field. So unconsciousness means leave the field. So that's one of the key things. Motionless and stays down longer than he should do. We'll just let this roll through. You can see then he's up and he's trying to convince his doctor that he's fine to play on. He's definitely not. He needs to leave the field. And he possibly has a sign of impact to his right cheek. Okay, we'll move on. Janelle, you let me know how I'm going for time. But hopefully we've got time to whip through all of these, because I think it is useful to see in real life what you're looking for. So again, we've got a tackle situation in the middle of the field. And if you watch that player trying to get up, and this is a very obvious one, but clearly he has what's called ataxia, loss of coordination. He can't stand. He's effectively rejoining the wrong defensive line. And luckily he runs straight towards his medical, who can grab him. So he actually demonstrates in slow, when we watch the slow motion, he demonstrates a lot of the most common things you will see if a player has a head injury that could produce concussion. So as a definite blow, loses his feet, and he actually does posture. You can see his arm up in front of him. That's not normal. That's your brainstem doing that. He then stays down, can't regain his feet, clear ataxia, and he's running in a sort of a banana line. He's dizzy and dazed, and he's unaware of where he is on the field. So he's demonstrating multiple signs all at once. You may only see one of those signs. You may just see the ataxia. You may miss him being down for longer. You may miss him trying to get to his feet again. You may be unsighted behind other players. You may just see the stagger. Staggering is not normal. That player needs to leave the field if you see that loss of coordination. Right, we've got 3 more. It's probably okay to go through those. So if we look at the next one, some examples that you'll see just aren't as typical, but you'll recognize them as clearly not normal. And you'll see what I mean if you watch this. So if you watch this player in black inside that circle, he makes a tackle. You can't see what he hits. Watch him now. So he is trying to walk and he keeps his feet, but he has a bizarre postural reaction, I guess you'd call it, where his brain is just not able to communicate. You know, it almost looks humorous until you think that that's his brain just has been shaken to the degree that he cannot control his body. It's amazing he keeps his feet. So anything like that that looks bizarre, just do the kind of basic common sense test. That player needs to leave the field. You don't need to know what it is. You just know that it's not right, and he needs assessment. Right, we've got a couple more subtle ones now, and these probably maybe the more common ones that cause trouble, where you're trying to work out if it is or isn't. So let's have a look at this one. All right, so the player in red, he's taken the ball into contact, and now he's lying at the bottom of a ruck. All looks pretty normal for now. He's holding his head, but again, you probably wouldn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Now you might look at him there, and he's struggling to get up. Does he look a bit wobbly? See, I'd say he does. And then his next involvement in the game is ineffective. It's one of the things we look at. So he just kind of falls over on his mate. This is one of the harder ones. But if you, but there's a few things that raise suspicion. He's had impact. This is all pretty normal. He's just stuck on the bottom of a ruck. He is trying to protect his head. See, that to me doesn't look great. And for me, that player at the least needs assessment. So he at least needs someone to have a talk to him. And in our level of the game, he would go off and, either have an HIA or have at least an on-field check. So there they go. They've decided that one would be an HIA. It'll be that kind of thing where you're stacking different subtle signs together. I would suspect that player has suffered a decent head knock in that sequence of play. Right. The last one. And again, it's useful to go through in your head those kind of criteria. Has he had a head knock? What did he do straight away? What does he do in the next 5 seconds? What does he do when he gets to his feet and returns to play? Now this one, you can just see him in the backfield there, the red and black player. He's just returning. We'll see it more clearly now. So he's the player who carries the ball up. So he's flying in there. He actually does get an impact, knocks it on. So when they knock it on, something's hit something hard. So that's your first clue. Have a look at that. Stays down, head and hands. Another clue that he's had a decent shot to the head. His delayed response is, we can't really see it, but he basically stays down, takes a knee, and then he does slowly rejoin the field. So the decision here was, at our level of the game, was an on-field assessment. Again, I would say that guy's taken a decent shot. He needs to be checked. But the last two, it is hard. You'd need to make a judgment call as to whether that player needs a blue card. And normally as the doctor, we would go on and we would talk to that player and get a clear idea about whether they were confused or whether they were orientated to place and time and person and whether they were themselves. And then we would make a call about whether they needed to come off or stay on. So that's the final video. Have happy to answer any questions anyone may have either now or at the end. But I'll hand back to Janelle at this point.
Yeah, you bet. I'll just jump to the next slide. Okay, we might just skip. It looks like we might just skip over this next one, actually. Oops. So I think our poll is not quite working as we'd like it tonight. But just as you guys are thinking, sitting there reflecting on the videos you just saw, so New Zealand Rugby, I want you guys to think. You can pop some answers in the chat though. But what are New Zealand Rugby's 4 R's around concussion? So if you guys want to have a think, and you can pop, you know what the 4 in the correct order are, you can just pop those in the chat. So from, if you're able to get it correctly, we'll do a draw for some prizes that will be sent out to you. So the question is, what are New Zealand Rugby's 4 R's? Well, we'll give you guys a couple minutes to think here, and you can just pop them into the chat. Nice. Looks like everyone's doing pretty well here. All right, we'll just give it another 15 seconds here if you guys want to submit some more answers here. And again, we will be collecting these names for everyone that's answered correctly, and we'll have a draw for some prizes that'll be sent out after this. Okay, 5 more seconds to get some more answers in. Oh, lots of answers coming in here now. Awesome to see. All right, so I will reveal the answer here. So the 4 R's that New Zealand Rugby recommends for concussion recognition is that first step, which is recognize. The second step is to remove. Then we want the players to go through a recovery process, which would be working through their, number one, we want to ensure these players are getting back to work or school, which is they're graduated to learn or work. And also, simultaneously working through their graduated return to play. So if you do need any more details on this, if you go to just on the bottom right-hand corner there, if you go to nzrugby.co.nz/concussion, the graduated return to play and the 4 R's are all detailed on there. And that last step, once a player has fully recovered and received medical clearance, they can then return to play. So thank you for everyone that was able to jump on the webinar chat. It looks like we had a lot of correct answers there, which is awesome to see from our community. So keep up that good work. And James, thanks so much for going through those 6 videos. We really hope that was helpful to see a couple of concrete examples of potential signs that you might recognize either as a referee or as a coach or as a parent or anyone really just watching rugby from the sidelines. So we really hope a couple concrete examples help to show what those signs might look like in a player. So next, I'm just going to jump I'm just going to touch on New Zealand Rugby's blue card. So this is part of New Zealand Rugby's domestic safety law variations and small blacks law that really gives the referees the power of removal for a suspected concussion. The key points here are that if a referee suspects that a player has suffered a concussion, they should immediately remove the player from the game or activity. As we mentioned earlier, we know that continuing to play with a concussion can then lead to further injury and complications. Referees, the key thing for referees, but also coaches, referees should always prioritize the safety and well-being of players. It's essential to err on the side of caution when it comes to any potential head injuries and should take appropriate action to ensure the player receives proper medical attention. Once a player has been pulled off, as part of the blue card protocol, players with a suspected concussion must follow the minimum 21-day stand down and follow New Zealand Rugby's graduated return to play. And I just wanted to touch on, so this is data that's been collected across New Zealand within our community game. So this is where we are seeing majority of our concussions occurring. So in the white on this slide is our male data. And this is from the past 3 years, from 2021 up until last season, 2023. And our female data is in the green color. Based on our playing population, we have collected a bit more data. There's, this is across 337 males and 77 females. So this is, we are working with select unions on collecting this data, but it really does help us to understand where concussions are occurring and what things that we can do to help mitigate that risk for concussions. So for our males, about 50% occur to the tackler, followed closely by the ball carrier, which is about 28% for males. And then for our females, slightly higher for the tackler at about 65%, and then the ball carrier is about 21%. So really, it really is around that contact zone where we do see the majority of our concussions. Number 3 is in rucks or mauls. And then kind of tied for 3rd or 4th is accidental collisions that happen on the field. And that could include things like jumping for a high ball, or it could just be running into your teammate, really accidental collisions that happen on the field. Very few concussions are happening in lineouts or scrums. And there's a couple of things that fall under that other category, whether it might be head colliding with a post or something like that. But the key takeaway here is that majority of our concussions are happening in the tackle to the tackler and ball carrier, which is why we've really tried to try and mitigate that risk by things such as the lowered tackle height and really driving home that proper tackle technique will help reduce this. So to summarize, this webinar, it really is everyone's responsibility, whether you're a referee on the field, a coach on the sideline, or a parent or a player. Particularly if you're a player on the field looking out for your teammates, that the more eyes that we have on each other, the better we can look out for everyone. As Brett and James mentioned, if a player is kept on the field, we do see increased risk for further head impacts and which could potentially put the player in a worse state and prolong their recovery time. There is also increased risk for other injuries, such as lower limb injuries or other musculoskeletal injuries. And this is because your brain isn't functioning at the best, that your coordination is a bit off. So playing on with a concussion does increase the risk for further injuries. Playing on with a concussion also does increase a player's potential return to play time. Data that has been collected within the United States, for every 15 minutes that a player continues after concussion, extends their return to play time by up to 10 days. So really recognizing that a concussion has happened and getting them off the field really puts that player in a better position for their recovery. So that's for every 15 minutes that a player plays on, can increase their return to play time by up to 10 days. And lastly, a player is not performing at their best. Their brain's been impacted and they're not able to make the best decisions for your team. So first of all, I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time out to become more educated around concussion on a Sunday evening. Massive kudos to everyone that's been able to join us this evening. And I will, at this point, now open it up to any questions that may have come up. So if you can just pop them into the webinar chat and we can kind of work through those. So first of all, thank you so much. We'll spend a couple of minutes going through this question and answer, and we will wrap up hopefully in the next by 7:50, so we can kind of formally wrap up. We'll spend about 5 or 7 minutes answering any questions. And if you do still have questions after that point, our panelists will stay on to hopefully get through those. Okay, so there is a question that's come in. I'll direct this towards James or Brett. There's a question around your reference to a memory check. Is this the Maddox questions?
Yeah, and I thought I'd answered it on there, but yeah, it is the Maddox questions. Although sometimes, you know, we modify them. You're trying to check their immediate memory of what's happening right away, currently, and their memory for things that have happened a few days or a week ago. So the Maddox is one way to do that. But if you can't quite remember them on the spur of the moment, you can make a few things up, and those will do, you know, and be better than nothing.
And just for reference, for anyone that has the New Zealand Rugby concussion wallet cards, which should be supplied by your provincial union, the Maddox questions are included within that pullout, and it's just questions around like what day is it, what's the current score in the game, what team are you playing? So there's about 5 questions that are included, and if you do have that wallet card, those Maddox questions are included on that. And then, yeah, there was another question on the stat. Might need to clarify this. So do you have the stats on the percentage of the tacklers versus the ball carriers in the tackle statistics? I will just jump back to that slide. So yeah, I guess we are seeing a higher percentage in the tackle, both for males and females. So the tackler sits around 50 to 65% of concussions, followed by the ball carrier, which is about 21 to 28% for our males and females.
Got one here from Yvonne.
Oh, yeah.
Is there any difference in presentation or likelihood of concussion between male and female players? I'm not aware of there being no difference in presentation. I don't think there's any difference in likelihood. Older data would suggest females have a greater risk of a more complicated course, although newer data may have refuted that, but that was always the older data was showing that. But in terms of presentation or likelihood, I don't think there's a difference, especially now with the professionalism of women's rugby full steam ahead. Unfortunately, we are also seeing a more professional group of concussions.
Yeah, I think there is, there might, yeah, I off the top of my head, there might be some differences, but I can take a look into that and share that around. But I think that's, yeah, I think we are getting a bit more aligned between our males and females in terms of symptom presentation. I think we do see Brett might be able to jump in and discuss this a bit more, but kind of differences that we see through adolescent presentation and adults.
Yeah. Well, they'll come in, they'll have similar symptoms are usually amongst the ones we know, but we know the adolescent brain takes longer to heal. They generally need a lot of support around that recovery as well. James, anything else you'd add to that?
Between the adolescents and adults?
Yeah.
Yeah, they tend to be more gung-ho, so that they're more likely to deny symptoms. If they've got a first 15 final coming up, you should be aware of that. And often their parents or caregivers will have a good idea if they're normal or not. And so your history may have to be, more through the people with them sometimes. Not always, but sometimes that's the case. And there's a clear increased risk for those younger players of returning too early or when they're still concussed. And so getting the right decision and being cautious and conservative with younger players is critical.
So there's another question that's come in. So what is the best protocol if you have not seen the injury, but the player's behavior is indicating a possible concussion? Brett, maybe I'll direct this one to you.
Yep. I hope I give you the answer you're looking for, is that if you have grounds based on what we've been talking about tonight, that this player may have a concussion, then your decision would be clear. If the player's safety comes before everything else, and you remove that player, then they get assessed.
Yeah, and I'd add to that and say that most often you won't have seen the injury. You will only see the sequelae. We have the benefit of video to go back and look at it frame by frame, but almost always you will miss the first thing. So you have to go on your suspicion subsequently. And remember, these players need to be removed, so health is the priority, but also blue cards can be rescinded, and there is a process to go through. If the player feels they truly haven't been concussed, and they can be assessed by a medical and they can be rescinded, and I've been involved in that. So actually, if you do happen to make a mistake as a referee, well, hey, there's a process for that.
Yeah, and absolutely. And we always err on the side of caution, because concussion is something that we take really seriously. And I guess the mantra that we really follow is, if in doubt, sit them out, because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that these players can play for the long run. But yeah, this is a common question. So maybe Brett, I might direct this to you. So how many concussions should a player have in a season before they're pulled out for good? I think, or Brett, I'll let you start on this one, and I can.
I almost hear the answer coming out of your mouth, Janelle, while you ask me. But yeah, I mean, if there's a second concussion in the season, we think differently about that one. Do you want to talk about specifically, Janelle, the New Zealand rugby perspective?
Yeah, I guess at first I'd mention that we know that every concussion is different. That there's a lot of factors that go into it, particularly if a player's had 2 concussions within 6 weeks or within a season. I think it really comes down to your medical professional, but we would, definitely, if we're seeing a player with 3 concussions in a season, we would definitely recommend on them sitting out for the remainder of the season.
Yeah.
The other thing there is if they're getting concussed more easily, and they're having worsening symptoms each time, so a crescendo pattern. Where it's taking longer and it's happening more easily. So not just the number.
Yeah, and there's some data that's been collected within New Zealand that just looking at in a very controlled situation within a lab with a controlled impact, that players do have altered head accelerations up to 2 years following a concussion. So there are some some things that are going on that might take a bit longer within your body to recover from. So we do see somewhat altered accelerations even more than a year later for some players. There is a question that's come in around headgear. I'll jump in and answer that one. So the question was, how effective is headgear for the prevention of concussion? So there's currently, with the materials that headgear is made out of, there's very little evidence to suggest that headgear is effective in preventing concussion. So currently, headgear, there's no evidence that headgear is beneficial in preventing of concussion. We are aware that there's other research ongoing looking at different materials and the potential mitigation effect of those materials. I guess when we look at the mechanics of a concussion does happen from both a direct, from that direct impact, but what's happening in the brain is that, I'll try and demonstrate this on the screen, but your brain is moving linearly, but it's also rotating. So, and we know from what we understand right now about concussion is that it's both the rotation of the brain that happens within your skull and that forward and backward movement. So even if a material could help reduce that linear acceleration, there's no way that we can reduce that rotational acceleration of the brain just by wearing headgear. The other thing that we keep an eye on is often the unintended consequences of wearing headgear. Some players feel like they become Superwoman or Superman by wearing headgear, and they actually might alters their behavior and playing on the field, so that they might go a bit harder into a ruck. And really, when we look at a scrum cap or a headgear, the basis of it is to protect the ears, for our second rows in a scrum, because they're getting rubbed. So it's really to prevent those grazes on the head, and to protect your ears.
And that's a good point about feeling bulletproof. I think that research was particularly in younger players. So adolescent and teenage players tended to take more risks on the field if they were wearing headgear. So it might actually have a counterintuitive effect. And there's some suggestion that maybe headgear can increase that rotation if you're caught laterally. So both headgear and mouth guards, and this is not the smart mouth guards, but mouth guards, there's no evidence that I'm aware of, and there's some new stuff that they reduce concussion in a major way.
Yeah, there's been some recent evidence out of ice hockey that's shown reduced incidence of concussion. I think it was about up to 28% with wearing a mouth guard. That was kind of more recent evidence that's come out in the last year or two.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So the next question is, there's a question that's coming around a blue card. Is the blue card the ref's responsibility, or can a team's medic ask for it? We're aware that there's some differences that are occurring in some of the provincial unions. So I would definitely check with your provincial union. And if a team medic or physio is calling for a blue card, I would definitely recommend that a blue card should be issued. But I would definitely chat with your provincial union around that, what they're following. I know that Northland is following that a team medic or potentially a coach could have a blue card issued, and it's really the ref. The ref is kind of doing. They would then do the step of submitting it with the union. That's it. A couple more questions that have come in here. So there's a question that's come in around if a parent sees a suspected concussion from the sideline, how do you report this? Example, to the ref, etc., even if it's in the opposing team. Again, some of the provincial, we're working with a couple of provincial unions right now around anyone reporting a suspected concussion, where we've got New Zealand Rugby has a web form that we're working with a couple of the provincial unions on. So it could be reported through that. Or you can report it to the referee or your provincial union. And then, just further on from should NZ Rugby make headgear compulsory for all players until the age of 16 or 18? I think from how we discussed that earlier, that there's not evidence that headgear is protective around preventing a concussion. So we would not be taking that stance, because we want everything to be evidence-based. Brett, I might pass to you on this next question. So when should a player not be removed after a head knock? So as in left on the field stationary.
So the player's down and not getting up, is that right?
I think they are suggesting that if we can give some examples of when a player should be just left on the field, and I would say that would be around if there's any suspected spinal or suspected neck injuries, that the player should definitely be left on the field stationary in those situations.
Yeah. Well, if the player's down and there's that concern, you're actually talking, if somebody's there who can do this, we're talking about a medical assessment. First and foremost, concussion is somewhere in there, but you're really concerned if we're talking about player safety, they're not getting up, there's a potential for serious injury. The person out there is going to look at immobilizing the C-spine. They're going to make sure the airway, breathing, circulation is good. They're going to go through a process that would assess that player that it's actually safe for them to get up. There is actually a safe way to work the player through that and stand them up. I'm not sure that's going to be available at a high school game where there's no medically trained person, but I'm not sure how to answer that question otherwise, is you've got to presume if the player is down or if there's concern for serious injury, you're thinking C-spine, you're thinking serious stuff. And only when you cross those things off the list can you then move on to thinking about concussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to wrap up with one final question here, and then I will kind of formally close the webinar with our hierarchy, but we will stay on for a couple more minutes. I know there's a couple more questions that we haven't quite got to, but just to wrap it up and keep to time here, I think we are right on 8 o'clock. So this last question, I'm not quite sure if I understand this question, so I might need this person to expand a bit more. But do you think we will see the concussion mouthguard system currently used in the UK and Pacific and Rugby Pacific rolled out to the lower levels over time? I think they are alluding to the instrumented mouthguards that are in use at the professional level. So this was a World Rugby mandate for any professional or elite competition that started after January 1st. So that's why we have seen it in Super Rugby and in Six Nations. So it's any competition that began after January 1st of this year. Yeah, I think from what I understand, those instrumented mouthguards actually first started in community rugby. There was about a 2-year study with close to 900 community players in Dunedin, which used those instrumented mouthguards. And then from that community study, then went on to the professional side. I think the goal with those, it really depends on the price of the technology. The mouthguards run at about $350 US at the current moment. So I think my belief of the companies is that they really would like those instrumented mouthguards to be translated to the community game once they can bring down that price to a more cost-effective price that a community player could use. So I think that is really depends on the companies, but I think they would love to see that translated to the community game. But right now, the cost is quite high for those. So I will just please stay on if there's more questions coming through. And again, thank you for everyone that's tuned in this evening. Oops. Thank you for everyone that's spent an hour on a Sunday evening talking about about concussions, and please help translate this evidence to your communities, because we know that concussion discussions, the more our players know, the more our community knows, is going to help our player welfare in the long run. So if there's any, we will stay on for next, again, that wraps up our concussion webinar, and thank you so much for everyone joining us tonight. We will stay on for a couple more minutes if there's any more questions that we haven't quite answered. So again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And yes, I will just add in, this recording it has been recorded and it will be available on the New Zealand Rugby website. I'm just scrolling through to see if there's any more question that has come through. Yeah, so there was a question that came in. Do you believe that there's still responsibility for players to recognize when they themselves have received a head knock? Yes, absolutely. The responsibility is still on the players to recognize it in themselves and also their teammates. There's often times when, from kind of the stats that we shared at the beginning, only 25% are often witnessed by a sideline manager. So players do have a big responsibility to recognize it in themselves, and often symptoms are delayed up to 24 hours. That they may have not had symptoms at the game, they may have not had them that evening, but it might be on the Monday when they go back to work or school that they realize that they might have symptoms. So it's definitely through our Rugby Smart and educating our coaches, really trying to translate out that information to our players so they can recognize it in themselves and their teammates. There's another question that came in. If a player is blue carded by the ref and undergoes the 21-day stand down process, if they see a doctor on day 6, do they still have to continue with the full 21-day stand down? So yeah, as James mentioned, they would have to go through that rescinding process. So you'd have to chat with your provincial union around that. New Zealand Rugby has worked with the provincial unions to have a rescinding process. That would require medical sign-off and video evidence to be rescinded.
And the video evidence would have to show that there was no concussion. If there's a concussion, you can see a doctor. It won't reduce the 21 days or 23 days if you're under 19.
Yeah, you basically have to hand on heart know that the person hasn't had a concussion for us to overturn it. And it's all 21 days now, James. Under
I'm
19.
sorry, I've looked up the wrong data.
It's 21 days. It's just changed though across all sport in New Zealand.
Pleasingly, we don't have any under 19s in the Blues at the moment. So
that's minimum though. So if they're taking longer than that, then that's fine as well. You need to make sure that they're fully recovered before they return.
Yeah. There's another question that came through. Is this research posted on the website? Yes, we do have a section on our concussion section that has a lot of the research that's been that New Zealand Rugby has done around concussion. I think there's a couple more questions about headgear, which we have answered. Yeah, there's another question. Our NZ are talking with ACC about red flagging a player with the players if they've had multiple concussions. Sorry, I'll repeat this. Our NZ are talking with ACC about red flagging a player for players within a PU if they've had multiple concussions. For example, more than 6 in 2 years. That's where New Zealand Rugby is doing some work with ACC to try and align our player database, just a bit of a data sharing between ACC to understand where our heat zones are, in terms of all injuries, but also concussion. So yeah, going forward, we will have a better understanding of our injury data across the country. No, I think that's everything. So if there's any more final questions, I think we will wrap this up. And a big thank you to all of our panelists this evening, to Dr. Brett Doherty and Dr. James, who have stayed on this evening to answer these questions. And thanks so much again, lastly, for everyone that's been able to join us this evening.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, we'll close this down now. So thank you so much, everybody. Take care this evening.